Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Alan Blotcky. He's a clinical and forensic psychologist in private practice in Brigham, Alabama. He is also clinical associate professor, Department of Psychology at the University of Alabama. Dr. Blotcky is frequent expert witness in false allegations of abuse and parental alienation cases. He is co-editor of Parental Alienation International, the newsletter of PASG. And welcome, Dr. Alan Blotcky.
You can go ahead and put that up if you want to. There you go. Is that up? Yep. Great. Thank you.
Give it a second to come right up.
Good. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm going to talk in a very clinical way about false allegations of abuse because I've done lots and lots of cases and false allegations of abuse occur frequently. I think we've seen in some earlier data yesterday that about 50% of high conflict separations and divorces have false allegations of abuse. That sounds great, 50%. It seems like in mine it's 98.9%. The point is it happens frequently, can you hear me okay? And it's a problem. So we know that there are many behavioral strategies that an alienating parent utilizes to accomplish the mission of turning his or her child against a targeted or rejected parent. Lodging a false allegation of abuse is a particularly poisonous strategy because we all know that it can virtually stop a divorce and custody proceeding in its tracks. It can cast the accused parent in an extremely dangerous light, and in fact, it can lead to criminal charges that can threaten that parent's very freedom. Simply put, false allegations of abuse are used as weapons by an alienating parent to throw the other parent under the bus and thereby gain power and leverage in the divorce and child custody proceeding. False allegations of abuse can be very difficult to refute because there's a natural tendency by attorneys, by judges, by mediators, by parent coordinators, and even mental health professionals to want to believe what a parent or a child says is the truth. Like, why would a child or an adult lie? Why would a child or a parent fabricate an allegation? And we know the answer to that is because a false allegation of abuse can sabotage the other parent's legal standing. And we know that a child who is strongly aligned with one parent against the other parent is easily swayed, cajoled, pressured, bribed, manipulated, coached, brainwashed via a false allegation of abuse. So what I really want to talk about today is that one of the best ways, if not the best way in my opinion, to deal with a false allegation of abuse is to develop a timeline, the use of a timeline. Because I always say this, I probably say it 3 times a day, I probably say it in my sleep, the timeline can tell the whole story. It doesn't always tell the whole story, but a lot of times, surprisingly, it tells the biggest part of the story. Because a timeline can show the sequence of events and behaviors that will clearly show, at least in my mind, that a particular allegation is a fabrication, it's false, it's being used as a weapon. We know that false allegations usually occur in response to particular events in the divorce/child custody proceeding. In other words, there are triggering events. And we also know that multiple allegations during a child custody proceeding raise the red flag of fabrication. In other words, if you have a case where a couple were married for 12, 15, 20 years, there was never an allegation of anything, and then we're in the middle of a divorce proceeding with a child custody action, and you have 5 false allegations of abuse, just the sheer number of them raises a red flag as to their falseness. So what I have up here, I think what I have, yeah, some common triggers of false allegations of abuse. Asking for a divorce, discovering an affair, hiring an attorney, filing for divorce, filing for primary custody, filing for 50-50 custody even, filing for permission to relocate to another city or another state, a new romantic partner, a child loving the other parent too much via some, outward behavior that's triggering, a child liking a step-parent too much in an overt behavioral way. The point is there are common triggers that we find in the course of a divorce and child custody proceeding that will trigger false allegations of abuse. And if you can connect the false allegation with this triggering event, that can become a pretty compelling timeline piece of information in a criminal case, for example, or a divorce and child custody action. So I'm going to talk about a particular case today that was a criminal case. And this is a real case. I've changed names, information, confidentiality is easily protected. But I think all of y'all or most of y'all have received a timeline of this case. Look on your tables. I think they passed out. So I'm going to tell you about this case, and you can kind of follow along with the timeline. Steve and Margaret had been married for 19 years and had a 4-year-old daughter, Susie, and 2 older sons, Brian, who was 14, and Mac, who was 17. Steve and Margaret had an up-and-down relationship for years, but they had never separated. They had arguments, but never physical altercations or any other alleged abuse. There were never any clear complaints about either one's parenting style or skill. So one day, Margaret approached Steve and told him that she wanted to stay in the marriage, but she wanted to see other people. She divulged to him that she had an interest in dating both men and women, but she wanted to stay married. And she also admitted at that time that she had already cheated with him with one man and one woman. Steve responded clearly by saying no to her offer and asked for a divorce. He told her that he should raise the children since she wanted to have multiple relationships going forward, and that might not be a great, stable environment for their children. In other words, he was going to file for divorce and file for primary custody of their 3 kids. The very next day, Margaret took their 4-year-old daughter, Susie, to an urgent care facility for an exam because of suspected sexual abuse of her by the dad. She claimed at the facility that she had found a hole in Susie's hymen. The medical exam found mild redness in her private area, but no signs of abuse. A hole in her hymen was not found. Even so, Margaret contacted the police and also contacted Child Protective Services, and in Alabama, that's what we call DHR. So Susie, 4-year-old Susie, was seen in a forensic interview where she divulged that her dad had touched her in her private area and it, quote unquote, tickled. Steve adamantly denied that he had ever touched Susie's private parts inappropriately for sexual reasons. He had touched her, probably many times, for routine baths and dressings, as all fathers do with young daughters. Steve moved out and immediately filed for divorce and custody of the children. 2 weeks later, the couple's son, Brian, 14 years old, reported to a teacher at school that his dad had choked him one evening. Steve, again, adamantly denied the allegation against him. He didn't even believe in corporal punishment. He had never even spanked any of his 3 kids. DHR was contacted again, although the police were not involved in this allegation. A few months later, Steve's attorney asked the court to order psychological evaluations of both parents. The judge issued the order. 10 days later, Margaret called the police and DHR again to say that Steve had penetrated Susie with his finger the month before he had moved out. Once again, Steve adamantly denied the allegation. He decided to voluntarily take a polygraph, which he passed. He also volunteered to do a psychosexual evaluation, which clearly showed no sexual interest in kids. So what happened was Steve was charged with criminal sexual abuse of Susie. He was going to trial. So the timeline that I've given you, and I've condensed it to some extent, but the timeline that I've given you was a timeline that we used in court during his criminal case to show the sequence of events as the accurate and true narrative of what went down and why this man was facing these allegations of abuse. So all three of the allegations that were made by Margaret were triggered by three major events, temporally. Steve's announcement that he wanted a divorce following Margaret's admission of 2 affairs and that she wanted to have more. Steve's filing for divorce and asking for primary custody of the kids. And then Steve's attorney asking for psychological evaluations of both parents. So all three of these allegations were lodged within days, up to maybe 2 weeks, of these triggering events. So this timeline was presented. Steve was acquitted in about 90 minutes. Thank God, right? So not all cases of false allegations of abuse are refuted successfully, and that I can't underline that more strongly. It's complicated, it can be convoluted, it's difficult, there are all kinds of moving parts, so it's not always easy to refute false allegations of abuse. Therefore, the false allegation of abuse maintains its potency and its weaponization, and it continues to cause problems within the legal proceeding. Clearly, false allegations of abuse should not be tolerated in custody decisions. Unfortunately, judges seem to have become sensitized to false allegations. I've had cases where there were 15, 18, 20 false allegations of abuse, and the judge seems unmoved or unmotivated, unfortunately. But I think such allegations might stop if the accusing parent actually receives some negative consequences from doing so, like losing custody, losing parenting time, going to jail. What happened to that? Fines, anything that's swift and negative and forceful, I think would be helpful. So, in summary, during divorce and child custody proceedings, false allegations of abuse do occur, and they can severely sabotage the legal proceeding that's going down. It can literally twist a case into a knot that can't be undone. But I have found that timelines, they do tell the story. More often than not, they tell the story. And if you plot it out carefully and look for triggering events, your narrative will magically become. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious, just my own curiosity, how long from the time that he filed for divorce until he was acquitted? Like, what was that a month? Was that a year?
It was less than a year, but it wasn't just a couple of months. You know, the criminal system is like all the other systems, they're slow. So it was less than a year, but not much less than a year. Yes?
Do you find that there's a difference whether the allegation is being directly articulated by the other parent or by a third party, like a teacher or, some other third party?
Not really, because a lot of time, yeah. Yeah, the question was, is there a difference depending on where the false allegation is emanating from? Is it coming from a parent or is it coming from a teacher? What I've found a lot of times is that alienating parents who are going to use a false allegation will get teachers involved, will get a doctor involved, will get some other collateral person involved to contact DHR in our case, or to make the allegation, to sort of, so there's a paper trail, and it buffers them a little bit from looking like they're the initiating person.
So, but if you can't connect or demonstrate that there were communications between the other parent and, let's say, a teacher prior, beforehand, and it therefore just looks like the kid went to the teacher.
Well, you certainly try to do that. You certainly try to look at emails, text messages, anything that you can get your hands on that will make that case. You always try to do that. Absolutely. And sometimes you're successful with that, and sometimes you're not. It's just the practical realities of the system, honestly. Yeah.
During the criminal case and the concurrent family or civil case, sorry. During the criminal case and the civil case, was he put on a TRO so he couldn't see his kids during the time if he was being accused of sexual abuse?
Yeah, he was.
So he didn't see his kids for
months.
Months.
Right. And I will say, I didn't put this on there, but so the original complaint DHR found as unfounded. The second complaint they found inconclusive. And the third one, I don't think they ever really issued anything. But I don't think it would have mattered. I don't think it would have mattered whether it was substantiated or not substantiated. I think the criminal process was already underway. And if those of you who do that know, once it's underway, it ain't gonna stop. Yeah.
So most of why I'm here is to really benefit my organization, but for what I'm going through personally, this hit close to home. So I'm going to ask somewhat of a broad question, in that just looking through this, it's pretty much the same story, minus the more interesting beginning to this case. But the accusations of sexual molestation of my son when he was 5, and it's been 2 years since I've had any contact, and everything's been going slowly through the court. And unfortunately, in the country I live in, it's more likely that I'll have to wait in prison for a trial, which could take another year or so. So I definitely will want to follow up, because I feel like I'm the one constantly having to tell my lawyers what to do, and they're very good lawyers, but not good enough. So my question is, in this case, you've given a good case here, but I know you've dealt with a lot of these. Do you have any type of statistic of how you find the number of false allegations for cases with false allegations versus how many have been overturned?
I don't have any data on that at all. In every one of these cases, they're complicated. There's so many different actors involved in it. There's so many moving parts. So there's no direct linear line between, if you have a great timeline that's really an accurate narrative, that's going to directly end up in a certain result. It just doesn't happen that way. Sometimes it does, but a lot of times there can be so many different moving parts that it's virtually impossible to predict with any kind of precision. But
I'm guessing that the quality of the
Yeah.
triggers are probably the most important.
the quality of the triggers, and the quality of your lawyer, and the quality of your expert, and the quality of everybody, everybody has to be on the same page, and it helps if everybody has a sort of unified understanding of what we're talking about. And if that's not true, then that muddies the waters. It makes it more difficult. Like you said, you're going to have to teach your attorneys. It's no fun, but do it. Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We'll get to you.
And this isn't necessarily a question, it's more of a suggestion to PASG as a whole, but we need, because what PASG is doing is such incredible research and study in parental alienation. Obviously, false allegations are a standard operating procedure in most family courts in the land, and the courts are desensitized to it. I mean, they see it as standard operating procedures, but it casts that bias. It's there to be done. So I guess my suggestion to PASG is to start researching false allegations and what states are doing to address the issue, because the states are being not only inept, but negligent in not even addressing the question or the issue. And it's a hot button.
Well, I think we are doing research. I think we saw some of that yesterday in the presentations in the morning. And false allegations are certainly a part of the data that they were looking at. But it's a beginning, you're right. And there's a lot of work to be done. You're right. Yes, sir.
Thank you. What level of opportunity do you find in the ability to discuss the potentially alienating and potentially false accusation parent? Are you able to introduce a behavioral profile of their actions, behaviors, or, I go short of making a diagnosis of that parent? Is that an avenue that you see that bears fruit in trying to counter a false allegation?
What I find in the court process in the courtroom is that they understand concrete behaviors more than they understand diagnosis or any other kind of mental health thing that we're used to doing. And so that's why, another reason why I think timelines are really effective is because judges can look at it, they can see it, they understand the behaviors that we're talking about, they can understand sequence of events, they can understand the temporal relationship between things. So in kind of a concrete, simplified way, they get that more than if we talk a little bit more abstractly about diagnosis or that kind of stuff. I find that goes in one ear and out the other because they hear it so much and they don't even know what that means. But they understand these behaviors and they understand timelines.
We've got a minute for maybe one more question.
How much impact does the domestic violence community have in these cases?
You mean negative impact? The negative impact is, as far as I'm personally, is that they try to undermine my ability to testify to this kind of stuff. So yeah, that I have seen that amp up. It's like in every case. So the answer is yeah. You see a lot of the anti-PA questions come up. They always did, but now it's really revved up, in my experience.
Do you have a percentage of what that looks like?
Probably 75% of the time. Now, I'm not saying it's effective, because it's not. In my experience, it's really not effective. It's annoying as hell, but it's not effective. Was somebody else? One more?
Thank you. I have trying to decide what question or comment. There's so much that I would have to say about this. But speaking as to what Cindy just said, the domestic violence community, I'm a part of both. I'm a criminalized survivor of domestic violence from a 14-year marriage to a child and adolescent psychiatrist that has now alienated our 10-year-old child against me. I've spent the last 3 years without my 10-year-old son. I would like to see a way to bridge the two communities together in the common goal of the best interest of the child. I don't know how to do that.
I think it's probably accurate to say that we reach out sometimes, they don't. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.